Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are returning to the Tyranids as a subject, and more precisely, the Tyranid Warrior, the closest thing the Hive fleet has to a soldier, I suppose, you know. Considering the name, that seems only natural, in comparison to the High Officers, which is stuff like the Hive Tyrants, or the, well, fodder/ammunition, like gaunts or the literal ammo of flesh-borer beetles and so on. For you see, the Tyranid Warriors are, most of the time, subjects of the synaptic networks rather than the rulers of it like a Hive Tyrant, and yet simultaneously they can be the rulers of the synaptic networks, they can be the control node if no other larger and smarter organism is around to take over the task, putting them in sort of a halfway state of being both officer and soldier. The Tyranid equivalent of a non-commissioned officer, I suppose we could call them. This duality of purpose makes the warrior a rather unique little creature within the Tyranid Hive swarm, which is most of the time filled with creatures created to fulfill a certain purpose, be it line breaker, army general, infiltrator, or, again, actual genuine ammunition. Whereas the warrior, not only does it have a dual purpose as both foot soldier and commander, but its specialty, if any such thing could be said to exist for a warrior, would probably be its untyrannic lack of a specialization, as according to learned Megosses who have studied the Tyranid bioforms, there are over 120 different variants on the base warrior chassis, for lack of a better word, as the warriors have been seen wielding pretty much every weapon in the Hive fleet's arsenal and every mutation along with it. They can carry anything from spine fists to bone swords to devourers to venom cannons to barbed stranglers to death spitters to rending claws to scything talons to, well, using their actual blood as weaponry with acid blood mutations or special springy legs, allowing them to leap and bound across the battlefield, or wings to make them fly. This plethora of upgrade options, in all due likelihood, came about due to the Hive fleet realizing that it would frankly be an enormous waste of resources to send a Hive Tyrant to watch over every single Gaunt squad, irrespective of what their actual mission was. Especially if you're a Hive fleet specializing in infiltration tactics or underground assaults like Jormungand, for example. It seems rather pointless to send an enormous Hive Tyrant down into the tunnels to dig down underneath the Imperial Guard lines and then burst up behind them with just a handful of Gaunts to eat their logistical supplies or cause some general havoc in their rear lines. Much better then to take the Hive Tyrant and squeeze it together into a far smaller package, both more economic and a lot more expendable, just the way the Hive fleet likes it. But it would be an error to think that the warrior is simply a throwaway life form. Oh, well, actually, no, it wouldn't be, because every single life form is a throwaway life form to the Hive fleet, with the possible exception of a Norn queen, and that's about it, but, you know, details. The Tyranid Warrior is a far more complex fighting machine than merely an infantry officer, as a Tyranid Warrior has access to the same hive mind synaptic network that a Hive Tyrant does. But unlike the aforementioned big boss beastie, the warrior does not have the mental faculties required to understand it to the same degree and level of sophistication. To make an example, a comparison, it is like having access to the internet, all the information in the world at your disposal, but you are obviously going to use it differently depending upon your inclinations. In this case, where the inclination is always going to be the most effective warrior possible, it would be differences in mental faculties. The difference between giving access to the internet to a 5-year-old and a 20-year-old. In humans, of course, this difference is due to, well, growth and experiences, whereas in Tyranids it obviously is by design. A hive tyrant is created with a very high level of tactical and strategic understanding, whereas a warrior is created with somewhat the same kind of general gist of understanding, but to a far lesser degree, probably by finicking with the capacities of their brain, one would imagine. Now, why would the Hive fleet do this? Why not simply create armies of Hive tyrants? Or at the very least, armies with the same kind of strategic and tactical understanding as a Hive tyrant? Because after all, it's not like all of this information is stored in the Hive tyrant's brain. It is actually in the Hive fleet. It is merely accessing the internet. Well, one explanation might be that GW didn't think quite that far ahead. Because really, if you can figure out how to make a brain access information, then figuring out how to apply that information to a preset series of circumstances, well, I imagine that would be a lot easier than making one capable of learning. At least if, artificial intelligence is any guide, but who knows? An alternative explanation might be that making smart animals with big old throbbing brains is simply, again, a waste of resources, as the brain is, well, fairly energy inefficient, everything considered, both in terms of its creation due to its highly complex structure, and in its fuel requirements, as the human brain, for example, requires quite a lot of nourishment, and when you're looking at animals like warriors and hive tyrants that are already massive and already probably requires ludicrous quantities of energy to even just operate, giving them a larger brain on top of it all is merely going to increase the energy burn. And by no insignificant portion either. The human brain, for example, eats up something along the lines of 10 times as much energy as anything else in your entire body. Thus, brains would be a significant investment for a Tyranid hive fleet, as it essentially exists at the brink of starvation at all times, since it needs to scrape every single gram of energy from every world it encounters, whilst often needing to purchase that energy at a high cost from its defenders, and then immediately move on to the next world again, seemingly suggesting that the hive fleet is never full, shall we say. It is always hunting, it is always seeking out the next target, as if it is literally living from paycheck to paycheck, as they say. The alternative explanation to this is, of course, that the Tyranids were designed to do this if we follow the "they were created by the Old Ones" theory as a weapon against the Necrons, where the Tyranids were made to wipe out entire galaxies worth of lives, and thus create areas where the Necrons could not exist, because the Necrons, of course, live off life as well, albeit in a very different form. Incidentally, I quite like this theory because I'm hard-pressed to figure out how a fully biological species like the Tyranids could ever have come into existence, simply because long before they figured out how to travel through, interstellar distances, they would have eaten themselves to death by wiping out all of the available nourishment. But let us not wander too far off the point. Let us return to the purposes of the Tyranid Warriors. So, as mentioned, they are first and foremost small formation leaders. This is also something that has evolved over time to be vanguards as well. We know, for example, that some of the first Tyranids to emerge in our own galaxy were warriors. Now, this is also partially due to the fact that the Tyranids' identity weren't fully established until, about 3rd edition, I think, roundabout? As the very first edition of Tyranid Warrior, well, it showed up in Warhammer Fantasy. Or was it the second one? No, it might actually be the second one where they were more fully formed. It's been a while, okay? I still prefer the old version of the Tyranids, but I talked about that in another video, so we're not going to go back into that now. But if you are infiltrating a galaxy as the, well, life-eating monster that you are, then it would make sense to deploy various vanguard formations and organisms. The lictors, of course, are scouts. The gene stealers are infiltrators and far advanced setup machines, intended to begin subverting planets and populations. The warriors, meanwhile, are more along the lines of force recon. They are the ones you send in to not just figure out whether or not there is food anywhere, or whether or not one can potentially create a food source somewhere, but they are the ones you send in to test whether or not this particular food source will be worth devouring or not. If the hive fleet can obtain more energy from a planet, then it will expend in conquering the planet. This is something that we see in all natural predators as well, where they need to calculate the cost-benefit of every engagement. Is attacking that animal worth the risk of injury? Will I be able to extract more nutrient from it than I expend in trying to chase it down? What if I fail? How much energy will that expend? What if I am injured? How much energy will that expend? And how much time might I be left recuperating? In the wild, an injury is oftentimes fatal, and this is why you will often see predators pick on things that are smaller and weaker than themselves. With some noteworthy exceptions, of course, but by and large, even lions, for example, considered great predators and hunters, will prefer picking off a zebra foal or a wildebeest calf rather than going after the adults, because, of course, the adults can actually hurt them. A wildebeest has sharp and nasty horns, a zebra has a powerful kick, and, again, injury in the wild is often equivalent to death. Now, admittedly, a hive fleet operates on a slightly different scale than your average lioness, but the theory remains the same, and so Tyranid Warriors, who are commanders themselves, would do this task perfectly fine. Dispatching a few Tyranid Warrior broods alongside some Hormagaunts or Gaunts, etc., to test local defenses would be an effective way to see how resistant a world might be to getting chewed on. This is also a task that will remain vital even during the later stages of an invasion, as obviously a planet will have areas with different chewing resistance depending upon local infrastructure and military presence. Attacking an Astartes fortress monastery, for example, high up in the mountains, is going to be significantly more difficult, and thus in turn expensive, than attacking local hamlets. The warriors would be able to judge this by, well, how quickly they die. Which might seem a pinch callous, but considering that these tiny microorganism, from the perspective of a hive fleet that is essentially its own sensory input, well, it makes sense. It is essentially like trying to press various areas to see where it is the stiffest and where it's the softest. This also then allows the Tyranid hive fleet to more effectively eat the planet, as it will overrun the centers of least resistance first, gaining access to those areas worth of biomass at the lowest possible expenditure, before then gathering up all of its forces, having cleansed the rest of the planet, to deal with the remaining tough nuts, allowing them to throw the maximum amount of forces at these targets, rather than dividing the forces and seeing them be chewed up piece by piece. And here's where the really interesting part comes into play, for you see, this kind of force reconnaissance is actually really goddamn difficult to do, and even harder to do properly and effectively. This is the area of special operatives in modern day militaries, because attaining contact with an enemy force that you have no idea about the size of, the location of, the organization of, or the equipment of, and then maintaining that contact without getting wiped the fuck out is hard. And generally speaking, it is achieved via one out of two means. Either you go the surreptitious route and use small and highly elite teams to detect the enemy and then communicate their position, their strength, etc., back to the main force. This will, however, always be a little bit of guesswork because you're not actually engaging the enemy, and so if you didn't manage to discover any hidden gun positions, for example, you're not going to find out about them until they open fire on your aforementioned main force. It is more of a straight-up reconnaissance duty. The other form of force reconnaissance is when you have fairly small, relatively speaking, but very powerful formations. For example, mechanized infantry with tank support that will actually seek out and engage with the enemy force and trade fire with them in an effort to make the enemy reveal as many of their locations as possible. This tactic is then usually subdivided into two different tactics: reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance by fire. Reconnaissance in force is the one that the Tyranids are most likely to employ, where you will take several warrior broods that will have different specializations, either ranged or close quarters combat, and support them with huge swarms of hormigants and termagants, dividing themselves into fire support, fire base, and assault elements. The warriors will then lead in their respective supporting forces in what will, for an outside observer, seem like a general assault on the enemy's positions. And there will be genuine attempts to make breakthroughs wherever and whenever possible. If the enemy formation, for example, proves to be weaker than expected, then a reconnaissance in force can very quickly turn into an outright breakthrough attempt, as the various elements of the Tyranid assault probe the enemy's position, looking for strengths and weaknesses to potentially exploit during the attack itself or during later offensives. This tactic can also be used as a pinning maneuver, as the Tyranids are pretty much always guaranteed to have a devastating numerical superiority over damn near any foe. They are more than happy to expend certain units to make sure that the enemy stays put. Because this is of course one of those damnable problems. If you're trying to locate weak spots and soft spots for future offensives, you need to be able to make sure that the soft spots and the weak spots remain where you last spotted them, which can be very difficult in the face of a mobile foe, which might very well vacate an area entirely and go somewhere else, or might even counterattack you whilst you are preparing the offensive. The Tau, for example, would be an extraordinarily annoying opponent for the Tyranids in this regard. But if you can constantly maintain contact with the enemy, using broods of warriors to guide in swarms of far more expendable termagants and hormigants, well, it's very difficult to disengage whilst under fire. In fact, as is commonly accepted, it is one of the most difficult military maneuvers out there, to disengage large forces from a determined and aggressive enemy. The second reconnaissance tactic we mentioned, by the way, reconnaissance by fire, is exactly what it sounds like, and it is something that the Tyranids could use, but they would probably be less inclined to do so. Now, the warriors, as mentioned, are very, very flexible, so you could easily form warrior squads with venom cannons or barbed stranglers, both of which have pretty damn respectable ranges, as reconnaissance by force is simply shooting at a general area in which you expect there to be enemies, and then noting down where fire is being returned from. You think an enemy regiment is entrenched up there in the hills? Well, lob some venom cannon shots in their general direction and see what, if anything, happens. If you get a smattering of lasgun fire, well, then it's infantry. If the squad immediately gets obliterated by a battle cannon shot, well, there's armor up there, and so on. And once you've determined their location, you can call in counters. Say, for example, that there is an armored formation up on that hill. Okay. Well, armor is of course devastating against clumped targets, but it tends to have a difficulty defending itself from the sky. And so you call in broods of gargoyles, perhaps led in by shrieks, which are the winged warriors we mentioned earlier. This formation would be able to swoop down directly on top of the enemy tanks and tear them open from their softer top armor. This might also be preceded by another reconnaissance in force, where a few gargoyle swarms are sent in, with some shrieks guiding them in, providing synapse connection. If then a battery of Hydra flak vehicles opens up, well, you try something else. But if it doesn't, again, force reconnaissance can very quickly and easily turn into a breakthrough attempt as well. And whilst we are on the topic of the more elite operations, this is again, of course, where the warriors excel. In modern human warfare, elite operatives are very difficult to come across. It requires a special sort of person to get through the elite courses of most nations' militaries. It requires determination, it requires intelligence straight up, and it requires a certain aptitude for the trade of modern warfare. In other words, it is damn difficult and very time-consuming to train an elite operative. But for the Tyranids, well, none of this is actually a problem, as they can simply just program their warriors to perform pretty much any elite operative task they need. Operations deep behind enemy lines, for example, or interdiction operations. These would both be very difficult, very demanding, and exceptionally dangerous for modern-day elite forces, as it requires them to operate within enemy territory for extended periods of times, whilst also actively attacking enemy logistics, thereby revealing their presence. For our modern militaries, this is very rarely, if ever, worth it, as losing a squad of elite soldiers for blowing up a few trucks and boxes of ammunition is, well, a goddamn terrible trade. But for Tyranids, well, take a squad of Tyranid Warriors, give them a brood or two of termagants and hormagants, and you have yourself a very effective ambush force that would be more than a match for pretty much any logistical convoy. They could operate swiftly, effectively, and with synapse connection to the rest of the hive mind, which is of course observing from up above. They would be able to locate targets of opportunity, engage them, destroy them, or if not, report their existence to further broods. You could have dozens, hundreds even, of independent broods operating deep behind enemy lines, like the wolf packs of World War II's War for the Atlantic, for example, except they are all in constant, untraceable communication with each other. They would be literally the perfect raiding force. And best thing of all, they are entirely expendable, as even if you have 100 squads of warriors, that is a drop in the ocean compared to the innumerable numbers that the Tyranids are capable of deploying on the front line. And taking into consideration their high level of coordination, in all due likelihood, their effect on the battle at large by disrupting enemy supplies is going to far outweigh their value on the front line as yet more shock troops to be herded into the enemy's guns. Now sure, lictors could potentially do roundabout the same job, and possibly more effectively as well, but lictors are also a far larger investment, in all due likelihood, seeing as there are very few of them, and their limited time and numbers would probably be better spent, well, eating commanding officers, rather than truck drivers. And, of course, it should also be mentioned that, albeit far more boring, the warriors can also be employed in their more traditional role as heavy and versatile assault infantry. And the warriors hardly disappoint in this role either. Due to their tremendous variety of weapons and upgrades, they can be made to fill pretty much any role whatsoever. Need some anti-tank firepower? As anti-tank as the Tyranids ever get anyways. Bring along some venom cannons. Need to overwhelm large numbers of infantry forces? The barbed strangler is your friend. Simply need a close range, assaulty bullet spitter, or in this case, worm insect spitter? The death spitter. I said spitter far too much in this sentence. Is your go-to. And, of course, they can also get into melee as well, with high strength and toughness, greater than that of a space marine, in fact. Bone swords, rending claws, and scything talons all make short work of next to any opponent. And that's before we get to their 1011 different mutations. You want them to be venomous? You can do that. Toxic? You can do that too. Want them to have little barbed things shooting out of their chest? Of course they have that ability. Want them to jump really high and fast? Obviously. Want them to fly? That too is an option. Want to give them extra armor? Natürlich. Want to get sued for ripping off the Aliens movies? You can do that as well with acid blood. There really isn't a whole lot of roles on the battlefield that a warrior squad can't fill. And of course, in the theoretical role of an entire Tyranid hive swarm, this could lead to some very interesting combinations. Bearing in mind, once more, that all Tyranids are linked up to the same synaptic network, meaning they can read each other's mind constantly, and be given combat instructions from the Hive fleet and commanding Hive tyrants. With units as versatile as the warriors, you could have squads dedicated to anti-tank, to suppressing fire, to assaults, to flanking, etc. And with the synaptic net, you can play off all of these complementing roles simultaneously with near-perfect coordination. Every assault formation covered every step of the way by death spitters and barbed stranglers. Whenever enemy armor makes its appearance known, immediately venom cannon teams would move in to harass and hopefully destroy it. When enemy heavy infantry is detected, the lighter armed spine fist ones, for example, would disengage, and rending clawed equipped warriors would move in their stead. In essence, the Tyranids could be engaged in combat and still continuously gain information about the enemy, constantly reorganizing, resetting, and maneuvering their own formations in an ever-shifting swarm tide to attack any enemy with the most effective counter. At least in theory. The actual synapse capabilities of the warriors probably means that this level of fluidity and command is going to be very, very difficult. A hive tyrant might be able to pull it off, but even that is probably a bit too much in the way of micromanagement, as the Tyranid hive fleet's greatest strength usually relies on overwhelming numbers, and winning the strategic war before worrying overmuch about the tactics of individual engagements. Nevertheless, it remains a theoretical possibility. Maybe you could even see some sort of super warrior, a Tyranid straight-up equivalent to the Space Marine, not just in, sheer stats like strength and toughness, but in terms of tactical flexibility, along with the innate sense to analyze any and all engagements and adjust as required. It could make the Tyranid Warriors the absolute ultimate warrior lifeform. Fortunately, going quite that far seems to be more than the Tyranid synaptic network is capable of handling, which is probably for the best for all the various non-Tyranid lifeforms in the galaxy, if they wish to remain anything other than biomass. And with that, I will bid you adieu for today. Thank you all very much for watching, and hopefully you'll have learned a thing or two about the Tyranid Warrior, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again next week. Until then, have a good day.